32 ticks following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing, snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow 2 will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale Kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session of the Ake Festival. My name is Aduke Gomez, and with me today is Kehinde Andrews, the author of Back to Black. You're very welcome. How's Birmingham?
Birmingham is weird. I'm actually had to come to work today, and it's because of lockdown. There's hardly anybody here, so it's a bit quiet. It's a bit eerie.
Okay, well, just as well. Back to Black is a philosophy of embracing blackness in order for Black people to be liberated from Western imperialism.
So Back to Black really is all about the politics of Black radicalism, and it's kind of the central thing to that is that we need to understand that as Black people, the number one way we've been controlled is by not being together, by not having consciousness and unity. And so blackness, if we think about blackness as not as European ideas of race, or not in these in the ways that we've always embraced it, is that, the way that the color of my skin, the kink in my hair, that means that I have a connection to Africa, even though my family is born in the Caribbean and I was born in the UK. This blackness means something historically, it means something in the present, it means that we have a commitment to all of each other. As Malcolm X said, we're in the same boat. And once you understand we're in the same boat, then we can start moving in the same direction.
Compliment you on a book that's thought-provoking, part heartbreaking, very personal in parts, but yet hopeful. Even though a lot of it is fairly heavy going, although you quote Malcolm X to say it's already too late. I think the fact that you have actually put your philosophy down as a guide, as a blueprint, in fact actually is a sense of hope. But before we get into the book, I think that we have an obligation to the moment. Okay. Breonna Taylor. I think that when the news broke last night, and when the policemen were not going to be charged in her matter, I just thought that it's just what you say in your book, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I wanted your thoughts on that, because also what also particularly struck me was I saw a clip of Black Lives Matters protesters and in Louisville, and they were putting the women in the front. And what came to my mind was, in your book, your comments on bringing out the Black lady. So I'd like you to talk about that.
Yeah, so I think the Breonna Taylor situation it's one of those things where it's heartbreaking, it's terrible. Also, what do you expect? I mean, this is what happens time and time and again. We've seen it in the States, we've seen it in the UK, this happens all the time. And we see it elsewhere. I'm sure there's lots of issues with the police in Nigeria as well. And people always seem to have this kind of hope that things are going to be different. And, George Floyd was just murdered, and that's led to this whole wave of protests and all these institutions saying, isn't things different, isn't going to change? And then you have exactly the same result you've had for every other grand jury over the last 50, 60 years in the States. So it's just a reminder that things really, really, really aren't very different at all. I think the Breonna Taylor case is also interesting because it is one of those rare cases where the killings of Black women by the police have had lots and lots of attention. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who I do quite a lot of work with, started the Say Her Name campaign because the Black women who were killed by the police kind of go under the radar.
Apart from Sandra Bland.
Apart from Sandra Bland, but there's been countless. Rakia Boyd, not too long ago. Sandra Bland. There's women, Black. So this is an issue where Black men are more likely than Black women to be killed by the police, and Black women are far more likely. In fact, more likely, the disparity between Black women being killed by the police and white women being killed by the police is actually higher than the disparity between Black men being killed by the police and white men being killed by the police. So there's a huge issue with the way that the police deal with Black women, but it doesn't usually capture the attention. And Breonna Taylor has captured the attention. And one of the reasons why Black women's issues generally, because there's a whole thing, and there's a whole bit in Back to Black about this, about how black women's issues of black women haven't always been centered in black politics is because the oppression of black women tends to be in the home. We can all see we can see the oppression of black men in the streets very, very clearly, by harassed by the police, by things like the George Floyd being recorded. But even in Breonna Taylor case, you know, she was killed in her home. There's no video. It's not as public. And so oftentimes we can kind of miss the oppression that happens to black women. So it's good that the Breonna Taylor case has had this kind of appeal, and it's reached out and it's kind of shown us that this isn't just a male issue or a female issue, because too often the issues of black women are kind of kept it behind. So we don't really address them in the same way we do sometimes for the issues of black men.
Absolutely. You talk about the misogyny of the entire process. You talk about the fact that when Rosa Parks is the face of, you know, the movement, but there was Claudette, who was 15 and pregnant, but she didn't have the right face, and she didn't portray the right, oh no, we are good, we need a nice, respectable looking person to be the face of this movement. You also talk about the fact that we look back at the Black Panthers and we think of them as macho, violent, gun-toting people, as though there was no room for women. And we overlook the fact that a lot of the work that the Panthers did was actually done by women in the back rooms and, as you say, in the homes. Perhaps you'd like to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so there is, like, the way that we think about politics generally, black politics specifically, it is really gendered, and there has been this kind of respectability politics, especially more so this is with the politics which are about how do we integrate into the system, how do we get reform. You know, there's the mainstream is still very patriarchal, and so if you're trying to convince patriarchal systems that you want to have racial equality, the mistake that we've made again and again is to play the game of patriarchy. So, for instance, you mentioned Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin refused to sit down on the bus before Rosa Parks took her case. It was an activist thing. She took it to the the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who organized the protest, and they didn't want to know because she was a pregnant teenager. They're like, this is not the image of the black lady that we need. This is not. If we take your case, no one's going to listen to it. Whereas Rosa Parks, it's actually interesting because the way that Rosa Parks' image is used, you kind of always imagine that she was an old lady. Like, you just have Rosa Parks as an old woman. Well, she wasn't an older lady back then, actually. Rosa Parks is actually a grassroots activist. Didn't really fit the image at all, but the picture you get of Rosa Parks just fits that kind of, isn't this nice working woman? Look how bad she has it. That's the representative we want for the politics. And that still happens. Unfortunately, that still happens today. And I think one of the reasons even Breonna Taylor, she's got nice images where she's in a uniform and she's an EMT, emergency medical. Yeah. They kind of, there's another reason why some black women don't get kind of picked up as the face.
She's respectable.
Exactly, she's respectable. And I think we played that game far too much. And we played that game with black men as well. But with black women, we play it really specifically, gets played very, very clearly. In fact, one of the reasons that we don't remember the Black Panther Party as being, because the Black Panther Party was 50% female, no, 60% female. And most of the people in the Black Panther Party were women. But part of the reason we don't see that is, one, because of this respectability politics. It's not respectable to be the Black Panther women, but not seen in that respectable light. And two, there is this really deeply problematic version of the Panthers, which is the bad Negroes with guns, who were kind of, they were this kind of like almost the gangster figure that we have now in hip hop and popular culture. That's kind of how we remember it. But that was like 5% of what the Panthers did. The Panthers did patrol the police with guns, but it wasn't most of the things they did. Most of the things the Black Panther Party did was feeding children before school. It was medical. Yeah, exactly. And even the thing, women's work, it was men doing it too, right? Like, we kind of gender their work. Like, all the Panther Party members had to feed the kids, had to work in the clinics, had to make the newspaper. That's what they were actually doing. That kind of macho, gun-toting, it's just a really, really small part that we've remembered as the massive part. And there were certainly issues of misogyny in the Black Panther Party. Nobody would say there were no issues of misogyny. But there was also a movement that had, again, 60% female, had Elaine Brown was the female chair of the Black Panther Party. They had massive discussions about gay liberation, women's liberation. There wasn't the place we kind of imagined. It was a place where women leaders came through strongly. And actually, a lot of the Black feminist work we think about now, if you can trace it very clearly to the Black Panther Party. So part of the work in the book is to remember what that politics actually was.
You don't have to be a man to fight for freedom.
Exactly. I mean, it's just interesting, Malcolm. So I love Malcolm X. Obviously, Malcolm for me is
Yes,
it's pretty obvious. If you heard me talk, you know I love Malcolm. I think Malcolm is mentioned like 200 times.
You love him, yes, absolutely.
I think Malcolm's like 200 times in the book. Malcolm comes up some crazy number like that. And Malcolm's criticized a lot because he doesn't really talk about women. So a lot of Malcolm doesn't talk about women. And when he was in the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam is deeply patriarchal, and so Malcolm did kind of mirror some of that patriarchy. But when towards the end, Malcolm was really clear that the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was his organization, he started. The first chairperson is a woman. He makes sure Lynn Shiflett has to be a woman. Women have to be involved in the politics. And it's really interesting in a speech, even when he was actually in the nation, there's a speech he gives, his most violent kind of symbolic speech, Message to the Grassroots, where he talks about this kind of image of the revolutionary. And it's a Chinese girl, actually. It's a Chinese girl. He says, there's a Chinese girl, and her father was Uncle Tom Chinaman, and I saw a picture and she shot him in the head. That's revolution. That's revolutionary violence. So basically, Malcolm's image of revolutionary violence was a Chinese girl. So it's us imagining that if we're talking about violence, which actually most of this politics isn't about, but revolution and guns and that, we must be talking about men. If you actually go back to the time, this wasn't the case. There's many, many, many examples of women picking up the gun and women being at the forefront of revolutionary politics, including Queen Nanny in Jamaica, Queen in Zinga in Angola. It's really strange how we're looking back now saying, oh, if you're talking about revolution and violence, you must be talking about men. It's never really been the case. That's never been the case that I understand anyway.
And Malcolm had girls, didn't he?
Yes, Malcolm did have five girls. I couldn't name all of them. Certainly, Alicia Shabazz. I just spoke to Alicia Shabazz recently. There was an event they did to honor his birthday. So yeah, Malcolm did have 5 young girls before he died.
Yes, and sometimes you wonder with men whether when you have girls, it makes you see the world in a different place, because you now begin to think about, actually, these patriarchal things that have benefited me as a father, I can see how they might not benefit my girls. And then there's a work to change it, because I mean, for women, a lot to improve. We actually do need men as allies, because they are the ones, unfortunately, who can dismantle. But then that brings us back to your argument that Audre Lorde said, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the house.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have a daughter. I actually have 3 boys and a girl, and I have a daughter. And having a daughter just totally changes, because you start to think, well, how would I want people to treat my daughter? Right? Like, that becomes a very personal thing. And so more than likely, this had an impact on Malcolm and other people, certainly. I think one of the things I try to do in Back to Black, and more generally, is we've kind of written the history of Black politics wrong. Because there's been problems of misogyny, we've assumed that all the movements are misogynistic now, and we have to move and do something completely new, and it's all about. But actually, if you actually look at these movements, all of them have always involved Black women. They've always been movements that talked about feminist issues. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, for example, the Garden movement, had a whole section in the Negro World on What Women Want by Amy Jakes Garvey. So what we have to think about with this issue is, and I think sometimes we make the mistake when we say there's men's issues and there's women's issues. Not really the case. There's issues which affect us, and they may affect us slightly differently because of our gender, but we're Black and we're all in the same boat. Whether you're a man, woman, queer, straight, we're all in the same boat. And partly we need to start understanding that we need to work through those differences together.
And for Black radicalism to succeed, all those intersections have to come together. Your argument is that if not, then there's no way that the Black person can excel or even be free of the oppression they have suffered.
Yeah, so the main kind of thrust of the book, and most of my work generally, is say that Blackness as a concept is the revolutionary concept. Because what does it mean? It means that we say that the color of our skin, that represents a connection to Africa, a connection to ourselves, a connection to each other. And that's not because of genetics, but because of history. Not just because of history, and even because it's the way the world works. Like, you might like to imagine that race doesn't matter, but it does, believe me, and it will impact your life, etc. So if we're saying the thing that unites us is our Blackness, then as soon as you start to put hierarchy in that around gender, around sexuality, around able-bodiedness, well, it just defeats the whole thing, right? You can't say blackness is the thing that connects us together, but. So in theory, blackness has always been that. In practice, yeah, it really hasn't. I guess a big part of the thing I'm saying in the book is actually that the concept is there. If we could practice blackness as it should be, then that's how you get the kind of revolutionary movement.
Okay, let's talk about blackness as a concept of skin color, because you had mentioned it in the book, and I was very happy to see, because obviously, hey, you and I could be cousins, but you talk about white psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about how white psychosis is actually not restricted just to white people, because colonial elites benefited. It's a thinking where people who are not white also benefit from the psychosis. Perhaps you'd like to talk about a bit about that first, and then we'll go into how does that affect when people look at people who look like you and me, mixed race, and decide, oh, you can't be a radical black.
Key thing we say is the color represents something, and the question is, what does that color represent? So for black people, for us, this represents essentially a connection to Africa. And we think about, because of slavery, my family is mostly in the Caribbean, in the UK, etc. What is the thing that slavery did in particular was it took away all of I can't tell you my African heritage. Don't know, no idea, right? It's gone. My surname's Andrews, of all things. That's a slave master's surname. So your language is taken away. All your identity is taken away. The only thing you actually have left, and this is why blackness kind of becomes a thing when we go into the West, but I'd argue it's much more important than that. Blackness becomes the only thing really that connects us to each other and to Africa, which is why it's so important. But also importantly, it connects us to Africa. So Africa is embedded 100% in blackness as well. In terms of white psychosis, again, this is not, look, whiteness is a real thing. It's not a genetic, it's a genetic thing in the sense you have what European people are white, but that's not what whiteness is. Whiteness is a system of power, of domination. Whiteness is the reason why, if you look at the global inequality, it's the places where white people live are the richest, and Africa where black people live is the poorest, and then this kind of hierarchy in between. I mean, that's classic white supremacy from the Enlightenment. And so the psychosis of whiteness is basically the ideas that are necessary to maintain this social order, right? So, for example, a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to proper food and water, right? A child every 10 seconds. Almost all of those children are black and brown. That's a race issue. That is the level to which racism still today is killing people. But we can't recognize it. If we try and explain that that's a racist issue, nobody gets it. Don't understand it. That for me is a psychosis of whiteness. It's deluding us into thinking that we're making progress, we're moving forward, racism will get over. No, the whole world is still exactly the same as it was. It just looks slightly differently. And the biggest problem we have now, actually, it's a newer problem as well, is that 50 years ago, there wasn't independence, there wasn't racial relations. We wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation on this platform. I wouldn't be professor of black studies. That's not gonna happen, right? So we all kind of weren't really part of the system. We weren't really in it. Many of us are in it. I make more money than most people in the world. I'm probably in the top 3% of earners in the entire world, right? I don't even earn that much, but given the global inequality that we have, now lots of us are actually, even black and brown people are benefiting from it. And so in order to justify our positions, we also engage in the psychosis of whiteness. We don't want to accept. And Nigeria, I went to Nigeria last year, and it was so obvious, seeing levels of poverty that I literally could not imagine. I still don't know how to actually comprehend the levels of poverty which I witnessed in Nigeria. I go to a hotel and I'm sitting around with wealthy Nigerians who are going, that's just what did somebody say? We went past this massive slum in Lagos. Huge slum, I can't remember what it's called, where they live in the water. The guy who with just said, that's just temporary immigrant fishermen's houses. Something I'm like, I know that's not true. Like, come on. But so people are embracing this psychosis because now some of us are lucky enough to be in the beneficial position. We don't want to know that actually our positions are just as based on the death of black people as the white colonists. And that's what the psychosis does. It leads us to believing that everything's okay.
Yes, because as you say in your book, reparations are due but are impossible to ever be paid, because in order to do so, the whole system will have to be dismantled. Perhaps you'd like to explain that a bit more.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, so we have this reparations debate a lot, and we're having it more now. And look, there's no actual doubt that we are owed a debt, not just from slavery, but also from colonialism, also from neo-colonialism. I mean, again, thinking about Nigeria, when it's outrageous the amount that the West is still today stealing from the country and the continent more broadly. So look, reparations are due. There's no doubt about it. The problem is, once you recognize just how much money we're talking about, so just for slavery and just America, the estimates are between $4.9 and $15 trillion. That's just for African Americans. If you were to add it up, the amount of money for slavery, colonialism, everything it's not possible to pay. Like, it's literally impossible to pay. Even if it were possible for that wealth to be transferred, that would destroy the economy, because the economy still relies on the exploitation of Black and brown people. Like, we are only able to have this conversation because Europeans and China, more not just Europeans now, China's involved as well, are stripping out the resources of Africa in order to make laptops and mobile phones and all this stuff, so that we can have this technology. So Africa should be the richest continent in the world. That would destroy the Western economy, which is based on the idea that Africa's the poorest. So reparations is literally, it's the actual argument for reparations. You could make the argument that the reparations idea of reparations is in itself psychosis, because it's literally impossible. Like, if once we understand what the system is, you should understand that's not possible. It's never going down.
Okay, when we talk about slavery, we're talking about 400 years of people being extracted and kidnapped from their homes. Okay, the effect of that is impossible to calculate. Okay, my surname is Gomez. My ancestor was a returnee from Brazil. He'd been kidnapped in the 1820s, and he came back after like 25 years and settled back in Lagos. So it's something that for me is also personal. But you say, and I think it's a very important point, that slavery didn't only happen to the diaspora, and that the middle passage is the umbilical cord between Africa and the diaspora. But a lot of people don't actually appreciate the fact that slavery led to colonialism, led to neo-colonialism, and that slavery actually is the original sin. And because of that, a lot of people tend to overlook it. Oh, it happened just so long ago. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So I just finished a book that's coming out in February. It's called The New Age of Empire: How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. And in it, there's a whole bit where I go into slavery, the impact on African continent. Slavery totally and utterly devastated the African continent. One thing that Europe likes to have this myth that it's really advanced, etc., etc. In 1492, when Columbus sails the ocean blue and the West starts to emerge, Europe is like the only part of the world in a dark age. They are behind everywhere. They're behind Asia, they're behind the Americas, they're behind Africa. Europe comes to Africa as wanting to trade, is technologically behind. Could not possibly have colonized Africa at that point. And it's through the system of slavery, which has to do gradually, has to do slowly, takes a time to develop, where they're taking millions and millions of people out. And that totally transforms, devastates the African political economy, totally transforms the economy. It's such a devastating 300, 400 year period for Africa. And it means that by the end of it, Europe can now go in and colonize Africa. So literally with that, slavery is it's not, we often think about those descended from the enslaved and kind of forget that Africa, where did those people come from? What was the impact in Africa? It was utterly devastating, and explains why you're in a position today.
When the Portuguese came, there's a very beautiful strain of art called Afro-Portuguese art. And a lot of them are salt cellar carvings. And the Portuguese would come and they would stay for months. And the people of Owo particularly, they would carve the ivory and then they take it back. And these are such beautiful, delicate items. I'm not sure if you've seen them. And that's such a wonderful example of how at that stage it was a respectful transaction. And then when it was, oh, okay, let's take these people and turn them from human beings into slaves, into Negroes. And at that point in time, their whole humanity is erased. At that point, you can do with them what you will.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that what we miss is that wasn't just for us leaving; it was for the continent. I mean, it was literally, and I'm not sure why, because it seems quite obvious, right? That there would be massive impacts for the continent where you take out millions of people. I remember in my industrial A-level history, we did the Industrial Revolution, and I was literally banned from talking about slavery, the impact of slavery on the British Industrial Revolution. Like literally, teachers said, no, can't talk about it. It's not in the book. Which is crazy. Literally insane, right? but one of the main causes of the Industrial Revolution was population explosion. There's more people, because there's more people, you need to provide more goods, and therefore you technology. Africa is today the only continent in the world that is underpopulated, still underpopulated. And what's that? Because of slavery. There's a legacy of taking out millions upon millions of people, and not just this is like the working age people being removed. So devastated today, still devastated today. So let's not talk about the past.
Yes, absolutely. Now, when a person is a Negro, Kwame Ture says within every Negro there's the potential to be a black man.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between a Negro and a black man in the black radical philosophy?
So the Negro is kind of created in the image of the West, right? So race is this kind of concept that says genetically you're inferior. First it's justified by religion, Bible, then it gets justified by science, then it gets and you think science is supposed to be progressive. Science actually makes this worse. It makes it really in your genes, in your blood. You're literally chattel. And then, after slavery ends, some of those ideas go away, but not really. And there's these kind of ways in which a Negro should behave. They should be passive. They should be deferential to the master. They should accept what's given to them, etc. And so what that quote about every Negro is a potential black person is essentially saying that there's far too many of us who are kind of stuck in this Negro frame of mind. We don't get it. We just kind of do what what the system wants us to do. And to be a black person is to embrace blackness. And also, blackness is not race. It's not a European concept. It's our concept, where we say, actually, the whole point of saying black is to resist, is to be rebellious, is to revolt, etc. So a black person is somebody who gets it, understands it, and is essentially ready for revolution. But the argument there is that everybody is potentially black. Like it's not about culture. It's not about gender. It's not about sexual preference. It's simply about, do you understand the politics of it? Are you with us for the revolution?
Okay. Earlier question, because in the book, you say that you're often asked that as a mixed race person, how does blackness apply to you? I find it quite an intrusive question. I mean, and I think that how could it not? But I mean, that's why I feel that the book is personal in a lot of the comments that you make, because obviously you've endured this. So when you're at a talk and somebody looks at you and says, hey, you're light skins, how does it apply? And then do they forget that Malcolm X's father was Scottish?
Yeah, it's
grandfather, one of them?
Grandfather. Yeah.
Yes, grandfather, yes.
Yeah. It's an odd question. It's an odd one for anybody who's descendant of the enslaved. All of us are mixed anyway. So like just stop straight away. Because there's none of us are genetically pure in that sense. And even Africa, the idea of genetic purity is such a wrong-headed idea, and a European idea as well. Because Europeans will say race is about genetics, it's about how much. And if you look at a lot of these categories, so for instance, actually, in the UK, I'm light-skinned but not considered mixed because my mom's mixed and I have a black dad, right? So technically, I'm not in that mixed category. Same as Malcolm, right? But actually, do you know where that categorization comes from? Slave plantation. I mean, literally, that is a classification of slave plantation. If you're a white parent and a black parent, you're a mulatto and you can have certain rights. But if you had a mulatto parent and a black parent, you're black. Again, you've gone back into the black category. So what we're doing with this conversation is we're just completely reifying European terrible ideas about race. Blackness is simply this. If you're mixed, then you're black. You have the history, you have that connection to what's blackness. Blackness is about the connection to Africa, the history, the present, being in the same boat. And you're both in the same boat by the way that you're treated by the system. The thing about the mixed race issue is it's a really strange conversation because it's really based on European notions of race, about genetic purity, which simply don't exist, particularly for those in descendants of the enslaved. All of us are genetically mixed. Like, it's a crazy notion. And even in Africa, this idea of genetic purity is nonsense. And all these categories actually come from the slave plantation. So I'm not seen as being mixed race because my mom's mixed race, my dad's black, and therefore I'm not mixed race, right? And Malcolm's same. His mom's mixed race, his dad's black. But that idea is really rooted in the slave plantation, where to have a white parent and a black parent meant you were a mulatto, terrible word. But if you had a mulatto parent and a black parent, you were black. It's really nonsense. Blackness is about, if you're mixed, you have the connection to Africa, to the diaspora, to the experience. You're going to be treated as though you're in the same boat. Although there's differences with light skin, certainly differences. But there's light-skinned people who are mixed. So even that, when we talk about light skin, there's loads of people who are mixed with light skin. And when I think about who's the most influence on me, the blackest person I know is my mom, who's mixed, right? So it's the worst way to talk about this issue.
Absolutely. And it's, in a way, it's reminiscent of the comments of Marcus Garvey, where everybody should just be pure, and which is why it led him, I imagine, to have those kind of conversations he was having with the Ku Klux Klan. That's the kind of route you end up in, isn't it?
Where that comes from with Garvey is the colorism thing. And because particularly in the Caribbean, and I'd imagine Nigeria is similar, but in the Caribbean there's a real pigmentocracy, even today. Like, if you look at the politicians, look at the people who run the country, they're really light skinned. And when you look at the majority of the people, obviously they're descendant of Africa, they're really dark skinned. And I think Garvey's mistake was he kind of too attached that kind of, if you're light skinned, therefore you don't get it, you're not really. He kind of missed the point on that one. Garvey, that's one of the mistakes you have to say with Garvey on the mixed issue, because it's just, and that does lead to, when you start to use those kind of European ideas of race and terminologies, then that does lead to, the Ku Klux Klan makes sense because they don't want to race mix either. So it's just an avenue to really, really, really not go there.
In your book, you mentioned that it kind of broke your heart to realize that Pan-Africanism isn't really the way forward. Could you explain why you had your hesitancies about that?
Yeah, I mean, the book was supposed to end with the Pan-Africanism chapter. That was an end. Everybody in the UK, we think Pan-Africanism is a solution. And I would say revolutionary Pan-Africanism certainly is essentially Black radicalism. Continent organizes together, tear down the borders, planned economy, return from the Caribbean. So that is still very much the heart of Black radical politics. Unfortunately, that's not really what the history of Pan-Africanism has been. You actually trace the history of Pan-Africanism, which is a formal movement, right? It has the first Pan-African conference in 1900. 5
million members.
Oh yeah, the UNIA had a massive amount of members, but it's actually interesting because the Garvey movement is often called Pan-Africanism. It actually is a different thing. So the Garvey movement has this mass appeal, 5 million members, has these conventions, but the Pan-African movement, like the Pan-African Congress movement, starts in London. Then there's one in France. There's one in New York. There's one in Manchester, the fifth one, which is really. But it takes, so from 1900 to 1945, it takes 45 years for the formal Pan-African movement to declare it wants independence. Before that, it was about how can we we just manage the colonies a bit better. And there is this kind of really bourgeois elite Pan-Africanism, which started in 1900 and is really the root of the African Union. The idea that we'll maintain these national borders, which make absolutely no sense. I mean, how is Nigeria a country? I mean, that's only a country in the imagination of British people, right? Like, it's not a real entity. And if you look all the way across the continent, the only continent that has straight lines on it, right? Because Europeans sat down and said, look, this is my country, this is your part of the country. And there's this version of Pan-Africanism which maintains so much of that through the nation state, through the relationship to Europe. You can see it heavily in Francophone Africa today as well. There's this kind of legacy where we are today with Africa, where the African Union is essentially a tool of the West, right? Like, it just is. That is a legacy of that kind of bourgeois Pan-Africanism. So that's why it brought my heart to write that Pan-Africanism chapter, because I'm like, well, because Pan-Africanism has been used in that way, maybe it's not the word we should use. Maybe we should just call it something else.
August Wilson, the playwright, he says, if you look in the mirror and you don't see the God you worship, you're worshiping the wrong God.
Yes. We
now have a situation whereby traditional African religion is demonized. So how does Black radicalism, how does that philosophy merge with religion as we know it today in Africa?
Yeah, so certainly Black radicalism has to understand that the way that religion, both Islam and Christianity, has been used, has been largely to control, to divide, to chop up the continent. Was it Jomo Kenyatta's the famous quote where it says, when we came, the missionaries came, they kind of closed our eyes, we prayed to Jesus, and then we opened our eyes, and suddenly they owned everything, right? Like there is a real way in which religion is using that in that as a tool to do that. Certainly, terrible history. Remember, it was also the Bible that justified slavery, and it was the Quran that justified the Arab slave trade. So we should not ever give these religions off the hook at all. So Malcolm's a Muslim and stays a Muslim, devout Muslim to the end of his life. And he basically comes to this position where he says, look, there's no doubt these religions have been used terribly, and they are still used terribly. And so it's a speech, about all the bullet, where he says, if you go into a black church, there's a white Jesus, white angels, white God and everything. Well, that's white nationalism. That kind of Christianity, that has to go. There's no place for it at all. But you can also find that Christianity has been kind of used in different ways. So the kind of there's a revolutionary black theology. Many of the slave rebellions were done by Christian preachers. So he said, well, look, if you go to a church and they're preaching what he called black nationalism, then fine, that's all right. Or if I can go and still be a Muslim and still have my beliefs, but still be involved in black radical politics, then that's fine. So it basically comes to this position where he says, look, keep your religion between you and your God. But if your religion's getting in the way of you doing what we need to do, then that's a religion that we can have no time for whatsoever.
Religion is used as a divisive tool. Mm-hmm. And so if everybody is keeping their religion to themselves, then you're going to be more focused on the more important things, which is how do you free yourself? How does your country become free? How as a human being can you get to a position where you don't feel guilt because you are buying into the imperialism, and you do because it makes your life comfortable, but at the same time you look around and think, oops, this is not how it's going to be, or how it should be.
I mean, basically all religions are the same in one way, in that they give you a system of belief, a way to get and navigate through the world. It's personal to you as well, and it can be really supportive, and there's communities around it. The problem there is with religion is when religion starts to dictate how you should engage or not engage in the social world. The kind of religion that says, well, look, everything's going to be taken care of when we die, so we don't really need to worry about colonialism, right? Because we'll be fine later. That's the way you shouldn't use religion. In fact, if we actually look at some of the ways that even Pan-Africanism is used now, certainly here, that's essentially like a religion, right? There's a way to eat. There's different kinds of spirituality, and that's fine as well. So as long as your religion isn't getting in the way of revolution, it's not my business, right? It's not our business. That's how we should be thinking of it.
We have some questions that people have sent in. I'd like us to take those first, and then we'll round up. Okay, so the first question is from Aliyu Tanimu from Nigeria. What inspired the author to write a book on Black radicalism?
I wouldn't know what else to write a book about. I don't know. That's a what was it? So the book kind of two purposes. One, I've been involved in trying to do Black radical politics for I don't know, probably 20 years now, and the main problem is that we don't respect our own intellectual and political histories. So we just kind of lump all Black stuff together. So it's like, it's Black, so therefore it must be the same, right? It really isn't. We've really disagreed with each other more than we've disagreed with white people. There are huge differences between these different ideologies. So, for example, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King did not want the same thing. They didn't see the world in the same way at all. They're competing visions about how we get to where we're going. And so we need to do justice to that history and understanding. So what I was trying to do in the book was really say, this is what Black radicalism is. This is what it means, what it looks like. This is what it isn't. It isn't. Well, half the book is just saying it's not this, is not this, is not this, is this. And then once we understand what it is, we can have a proper conversation, discussion about, is that the way we want to go forward? And that kind of is the purpose of the book, to say, actually, no, this isn't just an academic conversation. This is a platform that we need now. This is a program that we need now. And hopefully Back to Black has kind of articulated the need for it, and at some level the practice of it as well.
Okay. Now we have a question from Alonso from Brazil. The question is, given the state of the world, is Black radicalism a viable philosophy for the future?
Given the state of the world, it's the only viable philosophy if you want freedom. right? I mean, I think this is the one. So actually, more than this is the book I've just finished now. What was so apparent is that if we ever achieve Black consciousness in the kind of radical way where we say, look, Blackness connects us to each other, Blackness connects us to the poorest as well. It's one of the things that really gets me about our politics here, is we just kind of focus on, is there enough Black professors in the UK? That really isn't the issue we should be looking at. We should be looking at why so many Black children die before their 5th birthday, right? That's really the radical potential of Blackness. But what history shows us is that if we ever really had Black consciousness, slavery wouldn't have happened, couldn't have happened if we had Black consciousness. Colonialism wouldn't have happened. And none of the stuff's happening today would happen either, right? We are extraordinarily powerful. The problem is we've never really fully unified and used that power. So given just how bad the world is, and again, shouldn't be surprised given that anti-Blackness is one of the main features of the economy, if we ever want freedom, then we have to embrace the politics of Black radicalism and mobilize the power that we have.
We have a question from Joshua Greendale from the United Kingdom. How can white people be recruited as allies for the cause of Black radicalism?
You're asking the wrong person. Like I said, I don't know.
Okay. Maybe. Okay. Let's try and help him out and rephrase it. Okay. Perhaps not. How can? Should white people consider themselves as allies? How about that?
Actually, one of the philosophies of Black radicalism is that we need to rely on ourselves, and that's what the whole thing's about. Read Back to Black is mostly about how we've disagreed, what's going on. We really have to stop this idea that we solve the problem of racism by convincing white people to change. That's why I call whiteness a psychosis. It's not how it works. We've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. That's not the issue. The issue is that we don't mobilize our power. And the only people that can help us to mobilize our power is us, right? Like, so in terms of the practice of Black radicalism, that's what I can tell you, right? But that doesn't mean that white people have no role at all. Certainly, there's certainly, I think, well, there's two ways to answer this. One, there are ways which white people can certainly support in terms of the things we're doing. Let me give you a practical example. So we started the Harambee Organization of Black Unity, which is based on Malcolm's Organization of Afro-American Unity. We're going to relaunch actually soon, like in the next month, and trying to get lots of people involved in it. Now, in terms of membership, we're really like recruiting Black people to join to build the organization. But there's lots of campaigns, things we're doing. We're going to have a blog called Make It Plain. We're asking for donations on that. We're trying to get we're opening the Marcus Garvey Education Center in Handsworth, etc. And for that, anybody who want to support that, you want to help that, that's for anybody to do, and that's the way that you have allyship. So there's certainly ways in which white people can support. But in the core activities that we do, there has to be about us. And we have to stop this idea that we need to rely on anybody else.
Okay. Bendy from the United States. As you live in the United Kingdom, how do you see Black radicalism being promulgated to the younger generation of Black people?
The only way to do it is that we have to educate. And this is where, again, if you think there's a kind of liberal tradition that suggests that the solutions are, can we get into the schools or into the university or into the universities, into the mainstream, and can we educate that way? We have to understand that the schools just aren't there for that, right? The schools don't do that. That's not the purpose of them. And universities are no different. And one of the things, one of the reasons I actually called the book Back to Black is because my strong argument is that a lot of the things I'm saying we should do, we at some point were doing, right? About at least 50 years ago. And in the UK and in the States, certainly, there was a huge community education. There's a huge community education programs where we had what we call Saturday schools, where people taught after school programs. In the weekend, there were Black bookshops. We had revolutionary speakers come from all around the world: Zimbabwe, Ghana, Jamaica, and Nigerian speakers came through. We had speakers all around come through and educate. And I grew up at a time where, and in a community, I guess, where you couldn't avoid this information. Like, you couldn't avoid that knowledge. It's just there. It's part of our every day. And for young people today, that's not the case. And so I talk to young people all the time, and this is going to make me sound like an old man. There is a real political lack of understanding. It is. It's anybody can just admit it. But we can't blame the young people for that. It's not their fault. That's our fault, because we haven't put in place the things so that they can understand, learn, and educate. So it's about how do we build that community education stuff up, whether that is online now, whether that is going back to things like Saturday schools, bookshops. But it's going to be us doing that but not doing it. As much as I say I work in universities, so it's slightly ironic, but the work in the university ain't going to do that. It's the work in the community that's going to do that. We need to make sure that we're doing that, and not just here, across the world, because the education system in Africa is no different. It's mostly colonial, probably more colonial than it is here. It's really important that we're building these educational opportunities outside the system.
You say that Black is politics, but Africa is a place. To take this back to the beginning of our conversation with Breonna Taylor, with Mike Floyd, with Ferguson, I've been speaking to a lot of my African American friends, and they feel abandoned. They feel that there isn't support for them. They feel that they are alone in their struggle. One of them, for instance, gave the example that when the Chibok girls were abducted, that they, spoke about it, and, there were movements, but that we in Africa, we're all just watching the news and are silent, and they feel alone. So one of the things in your book is that Black radicalism can really only succeed when the diaspora and Africa are actually hand in hand. So how do these gaps, how can they be overcome? How can the breaches of trust between the diaspora and Africa be filled?
Yeah, it is a problem. Even when we think about something like blackness, there is kind of idea, oh, that's for the West, that's for the diaspora, that's not an African thing. I've seen that many times. Still now we have that kind of idea. And if you look at the way that, the protests here, America generally has a lot of prominence in the world broadly, but also in the Black experience. One of the big problems with the way that it is very national, right? Really, really, really national. Even to the point of just like police brutality in America. A lot of people in America wouldn't have any idea what was going around the world either. So it's, again, deeply problematic. And I think this is, again, going back. This is it's actually ironic. We actually got more connections to each other now through things like this, right? It's literally impossible, not even that long ago. But we got more connections to each other, but actually our politics are really, really more national. Whereas back in the day, it was far more global. As I was saying, like, we would have speakers, issues. We'd have the black press here would be about what's happening in Zimbabwe, what's happening in the Caribbean, what's happening in America, what's happening not in Latin America. I mean, there's a language issue as well as a big part of this. So we really need to stress that blackness is just as important in Africa. In fact, again, when I said black slavery couldn't have happened if we had Black consciousness, that's true. That's a true statement. If we had Black consciousness today on the African continent in the diaspora, then you couldn't have the kind of neo-colonial regimes that run, right? So Black consciousness is important in both spaces, which can get missed in Africa because obviously everybody's Black, right? So it's more easier where everybody's not Black or you're a minority. So we can think of it as a minority issue, but we're just kind of missing it. And so in order to really understand what's happening, we have to have an internet. You can understand it. Nationalist people do this all the time, but they're misunderstanding it. And so one of those things we have to do is really focus a lot more on what's happening on the African continent. Because when we talk about the wretched of the earth, the people, the conditions, I don't want to make it sound like Africa's terrible. There's definitely good things happening. But if we're honest, the conditions that many and large versions of the continent live on, we can't imagine in the West. Like, we literally can't imagine it. I remember, like I said, when I went to Nigeria, I still can't really comprehend what that's like. And you're right, those issues haven't really become part of the Black discussion here, which is a shame. And that's partly what Back to Black is saying, is that we need to be talking about all of us, not just parts.
Mm-hmm. And is that how you feel that community is important? Because you end the book by saying Black radicalism can't really progress unless you quote again Malcolm X. If you're not in a community, you're not doing anything. Mm-hmm. What do you think Malcolm meant by that, and how do you see that feeding into the Black radicalism philosophy? Yeah, so there's a Black radicalism is all about saying that the only way really that we're going to deal with any of these problems is as a collective who organizes, who pools resources, who brings things together. If you look at the essential model that we're trying to do, the Rambi Organization of Black Unity, is a tweak of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which really did have this kind of model where it said, look, grassroots, so 5 million members, 50 countries, had grassroots in different parts of the world. You do individual, like your organization would do what's the local issues in Lagos and what's the local issues in Birmingham in the UK. They're going to be different, but we're still part of this bigger collective. And once you can mobilize that into the main, that's how we get power. So if you're the
the quote you quote is about, and I see this all the time. So many times, black people will complain about stuff. I don't like this. I don't like that. Da, 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 da. What are you doing? Like, if you're not doing anything, stop complaining. Stop. Right? Like, we have a responsibility to be involved and to be engaged. And so, but we too much of the time we're just talking and complaining, and we're not actually just going out and doing the difficult work.
Okay. I think we're just about probably going to run out of time. So I'm just going to ask you to just round up for us. Black radicalism. When you wrote the book, one, who did you intend to impact upon? And two, what would make you happy in how your book is being impactful? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Who is it for? I think certainly it was for, there's a whole generation now of activists, young black activists, who are looking and saying, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? And so the main focus of the book was there to say, well, look, there is this politics of black radicalism. It isn't pie in the sky, right? It isn't, because this is the other thing with radical politics. We generally tend to just dismiss it as it's not possible, couldn't possibly happen, etc. And we misunderstand it. So the main focus was, look, for those people who are interested and who are doing stuff, and there's millions of us out there now, there is a history, there is a legacy, there is a program that we can pick up, right? And I've seen lots of people read it in that way, which is really positive. I think the other group would be, there's a quote that Malcolm says, if you're black and you're not thinking black at this late stage, then I'm sorry for you. And Back to Black really is a way to get you to think black, hopefully. And I know a few people have read it and they're going, I never thought about it like that. I never thought about it like that. And now the way that I think about things has changed. Again, all my quotes are Malcolm X. I do read other people, but Malcolm kind of, particularly for black radicalism, is always a go-to. Where he talks about when he was in prison and he started reading, and before he was kind of like, he'd say a Negro, like I was in that kind of Negro mentality. And then when he started reading, it was like snow falling off a roof, and it completely transformed how he understood things. Hopefully Back to Black can have that impact. And certainly I know that's what makes me happy, because I've spoken to a lot of people who read it and said it actually changed my mind in that sense. But really, honestly, again, if we're not then acting on that, there's no point. Like, if people are just reading it and going, oh yeah, that's nice. I don't know. That's not the purpose. The purpose of the book is like, go and do stuff. Go and join an organization. We have the Harambee Organization of Black Unity. There's other organizations, or start an organization. What made me happy is to see that people pick up the program, which is the key thing, and then start to put that into action.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do you have anything else you'd like to say? Any last comments? And then ringing the bell.
Oh, ringing the bell. I don't know. I think because my cousin is Nigeria, and I think that really just stressing this idea that this is not probably Back to Black is more. Look, I live in Britain, America, like it's probably more Western influence. I definitely tried to pick up the African revolutionary struggle and that stuff, and that. But this really isn't just a book that was written for the West. The root of black radicalism is revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Without revolutionary Pan-Africanism, there is no black. That is what the basic function of the politics of black radicalism is. So when we're talking about building, we have to be talking about building connections between us here and on the continent. In the UK is interesting because of this colonial outpost. Diaspora for us is automatic, unlike America, where they kind of get carried away with America. One of the limits of that, though, is that when we engage with Africans here, we don't tend to engage with Africans on the ground. There's no how would you possibly, someone in Britain, how would you possibly be able to engage with the grassroots in Nigeria? Like, there's just no connection for that. And so when we're thinking about building those connections, we have to be thinking about that. We have to be thinking about the least of us. And that's a difficult thing to do that certainly I can't do. I'm not in a position to do that at all. But that's one of the big problems that this kind of idea of black unity has always had, is how do we get those people who are so disconnected that it's difficult to engage. And that's really the radical and revolutionary project. Solve the problem for the poorest person, you solve the problem for everybody. And that's where we should be focusing the attention.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kehinde. I've really enjoyed talking to you and meeting you. Hopefully we can meet again when you next come to Lagos, hopefully in happier times. Stay safe. Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right, then.
Sticky, spicy, sweet. Now, I want to go.
Don't touch me! I will get you arrested!
Gomez. Very, very witty.
Relax, everybody!
He shot you!
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. Then it seems like I'm nowhere to be found. If you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book. You'll never be alone. Now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the word in a book.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.